Now, two pigeons and Coach Prime bemoaning the fact you can stream DirecTV satellite-free.
These humans get the biggest college football games on DirecTV,
and we don't even get a satellite dish.
Enough squawking.
It's Coach Prime.
Bring it in. Sure, they could get all that college football without a dish, but you still got your passion, your drive, your resolve, your
incredible career as a football icon?
No, that's me.
Stream the biggest college football games, no satellite dish. Visit DirecTV.com.
Empire.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Last Man Standig podcast. Yes, I'm your host, Ben Standig, and I cover the Washington Commanders for The Athletic. Rare to do a weekend podcast, but it's rare to have a Monday night football game. So every practice this week was pushed back a day, meaning today on Saturday, the Commanders had their Friday practice, typically a shorter one, but we start to get a feel for the upcoming game. Of course, Monday night against the Cincinnati Bengals. Some news today out of the team regarding the game. We'll get into that in a moment. I had promised that I was going to share the audio version of the live chat that I did with subscribers to The Athletic this week. And I listened back to it, and there was a clicking sound and whatever. I don't know what's going on, but I decided I'll just, instead of doing that, I'm just going to do a fuller podcast here. Since Peter King is no longer using the 10 things, I think I'm going to kind of steal that format and go through some key points that I'm thinking about, both in terms of this game and also just kind of the Commanders in general. So that's the plan here on this episode of the podcast. If you missed anything else that I had up this week, including an interview with Jay Gruden, you can check that out on iTunes or wherever you do your podcasting. Of course, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss any of the upcoming podcasts. And of course, also subscribe to The Athletic. Had a story up about Noah Brown's emergence and his journey to Washington, a lengthy injury-plagued journey, but hopefully this is a place where he can finally have a real steady impact for a team. We already saw how in game one with him that he definitely made that impact for sure. So we'll do all that. A programming note for those of you who are interested. So the Commanders are playing Monday in Cincinnati. The following week, they're playing at Arizona. So what the Commanders have decided to do, rather than go from Cincinnati back to Washington after the game, or back to Ashburn after the game, and then, have to fly all the way across the country later in the week, they've decided to go straight from Cincinnati to Phoenix for the week. So they're going to practice all week in Phoenix. I am going to go and will be there for that. So you'll have, if you make sure you subscribe here, you'll hear the podcast live. Well, I guess I shouldn't say live, but from the scene of all the action. Of course, Jaden Daniels went to Arizona State. So a little bit of a homecoming for him, and Cliff Kingsbury as well, of course, coached the Cardinals for 4 years. So that's going to be the plan for next week. You guys won't notice anything necessarily different other than everything may be a little bit delayed on the time schedule because we'll be dealing with things on West Coast time. So that's something to keep an eye out for next week. All right. Let's get to, we'll say 10 things I think for this week. So let's get to the biggest news in terms of week 3. Dan Quinn today told us that Clelin Ferrell will not play in Monday night. He's been dealing with a knee issue going back to training camp. He was a DNP last Friday, so before week 2, but it still ended up playing. He got a sack in that game, has Washington's only 2 sacks. He's not really known as a major pass rusher, but that's the way things have worked out. But Quinn said that the knee has not kind of, worked out as they would have liked. So they're giving him more time to rest. Doesn't sound like it's going to be a long-term issue, but nonetheless, no Clelin Ferrell this week. So what does that mean? So you've got Dorrance Armstrong on one side. Your other defensive end options are essentially Dante Fowler, who they've used at linebacker and a bit. So I don't know if I see Fowler's role increasing too much, but we'll see about that. They also have, of course, Jamin Davis. Expect him to be active this week. He was inactive a week ago, played 12 snaps in the opener. More of an opportunity here for him. But based on what Dan Quinn had to say today, I'm kind of thinking that this is a chance where Javonte Jean-Baptiste, the 7th round pick out of Notre Dame, ends up taking on a decent role. Let's remember, he was up last week when Jamin Davis was inactive. So every game, matchups could be dependent, and you can't always assume one thing means automatically something else. But nonetheless, I think Javonte Jean-Baptiste has a chance. I don't know if he's ignore start. That doesn't really matter so much, but has a chance to be heavily involved in the rotation this week. Now, when I asked today to Dan Quinn about this, so what happens with the rotation with Ferrell out, and he mentioned specifically, more with Dante Fowler, because he's got some experience. He was then later asked about Jamin Davis, and if this means, without Ferrell, he'd get more snaps. And here's his response, quote, "It would be more." Then he goes on, "Javonte, I thought, is coming on as well. And so to see guys start to make their move, Javonte and Johnny Newton stood out to me specifically this week. Their legs underneath them, the speed to go," end quote. So that's interesting to me. Again, this is just interpretation. I don't know for a fact. It sounds to me, based on what he has said, and he had some other comments about this, that Javonte Jean-Baptiste is still going to be ahead of Jamin Davis in the rotation. He's got some good length, good speed, and again, we're not saying this is the next Montez Sweat or anything, but I think in this game he may be the one end, other than whatever increase Fowler gets, to stand out. But here's where I think it gets interesting: the fact that Dan Quinn mentioned Johnny Newton in a conversation about, or a question about, the defensive end. Now, he may have just been saying, hey, here's two guys I think young guys have been improving. Obviously, Newton got in his first action last week, only played 12 snaps. Dan Quinn already told us earlier in the week Newton would play more. But if you're telling me the defensive end rotation without Ferrell is essentially some version of Dante Fowler, Jean-Baptiste, and Jamin Davis, I mean, obviously that doesn't sound particularly inspiring, to the point that maybe you get a little frisky here and do some other things. Now, Frankie Louvu would be an option, of course, right? That's been the whole notion since they brought him in. But he's a guy that could play here, there, and everywhere, and he definitely came off the edge at times with the Panthers. He's played 16 snaps on the defensive line so far in the 2 games. However, here's my wild card here. He mentioned Johnny Newton, and I wondered this going back to the summer when we looked at the defensive line and we're like, that one defensive end spot is kind of up for grabs, even if Ferrell is available. And you've got Johnny Newton, who, they think is going to be a train wrecker in the middle there. But you're going to have to play Allen and Payne a lot, too. Is there a world where you can play all 3 guys? Maybe it's not ideal because, of course, they're, 3 defensive tackles, you're probably losing a little bit of speed. But it's also a lot of power. The Washington's run game has been weak the first 2 games. They haven't been generating much of a pass rush anyway. So, again, could be nothing, but I'm sort of interpreting Dan Quinn's mention of Johnny Newton in the conversation of the defensive ends as something to keep an eye on. Again, at least for me, it was already something I had thought about over the summer. I wonder if this plays out. And it does, again, if we're saying that like they don't have any defensive end that it's like worthy of getting a high number of snaps, and you think Newton is one of your better defensive linemen, sometimes it just makes sense to go for your best guys and go from there. So I wonder if that's something they will consider. I certainly will be keeping an eye on that this week. Now, we don't know how many more snaps Newton's going to get. Of course, there's that as well. But yeah, we'll see. So that would be my assumption, but that's a possibility, I think. I don't know if they're going to bring up anybody else off the practice squad. Sheldon Day is a defensive tackle. I guess you could bring him up if you felt like it. But yeah, so that's what I think. That's something I'm going to keep an eye on with this group on Monday. And by the way, Newton, Cincinnati's offensive tackles are massive human beings. They're all like 6'7", 6'8", 300 plus pounds, huge guys. So having a guy like Newton going up against them maybe isn't the worst idea, especially since they don't have some like elite pass rusher to get around the edge. So that's another reason why maybe this is something to consider.
This episode is brought to you by Allstate. Some people just know they could save hundreds on car insurance by checking Allstate first. Like, to check you have the tickets in your wallet first before you drive 2 hours to the big game. Seriously, you had one job. Now the closest you'll get to the 50-yard line is parking lot D. Yeah, checking first is smart. So check Allstate first for a quote that could save you hundreds. You're in good hands with Allstate. Savings vary. Terms apply. Allstate Fire and Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Northbrook, Illinois.
Earning your degree online doesn't mean you have to go about it alone. At Capella University, we're here to support you when you're ready. From enrollment counselors who get to know you and your goals, to academic coaches who can help you form a plan to stay on track. We care about your success and are dedicated to helping you pursue your goals. Going back to school is a big step, but having support at every step of your academic journey can make a big difference. Imagine your future differently at capella.edu.
Let's move on to number 2. This is from the Bengals side of things. T. Higgins, one of their top 2 wide receivers, has not played yet this year, but he is going to go this week for Cincinnati. Look, obviously Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, that's been a huge part of their offense the last few years. T. Higgins, was also, like Jamar Chase, has been angling for a new contract. They used the franchise tag on him. He didn't get it. So him making his debut, like, it's a good time to get the Bengals in that regard, because he's going to have some rust, you would have to think. Jamar Chase, I don't know where his head's at. He didn't get his extension. He's been a little bit off so far this year. But again, the Bengals are the team that are going to come in here. They've got a lot. The Bengals have a lot to lose in this game. They go to 0-3, and we can start writing off how many real chances of them, well, at least finishing high in the AFC. Whether they come back to make the playoffs, I don't know. But they go to 0-3, and you got to start asking questions, especially if your 2 losses were to New England and now Washington, teams that picked 2nd and 3rd in the draft the last year. Nonetheless, T. Higgins is a big-time weapon. And if Jamar Chase now in his 3rd game after sitting out for most of the summer, that just having Higgins' presence there might force Washington to not send as much help to Chase's way, perhaps. And therefore, either way, one of those guys has a chance to go off. And we'll talk more about that in a second. But I think that's where Cincinnati has a huge advantage if, in fact, Higgins is ready to go. But he's going to play, so that's a big deal, needless to say, for the Bengals. And sort of my point number 3 sort of ties into this. Like I just said, Cincinnati's in a weird space, right? They lose to New England in a week 1, which, these early weeks, it's sort of, it's almost like preseason games at this point. So I think you're typically ripe for more upsets in week 1 or 2, but even more so now where teams are barely playing in the preseason. But in their case, because these 2 receivers are still in contract disputes to a degree, what does that mean? I'm not obviously there. I'm not in the locker room, but if their chemistry isn't right, if they're not feeling it, if there's sort of this cloud hanging over the situation, that could be why the Bengals ultimately don't match expectation or sniff expectations. So how much does that factor into what's happening? Now, of course, they almost beat the Chiefs last week, but if they don't get called for a pass interference, they do beat the team that we would still say is the best in the league. So it's not like they have been bad, and a game like Chiefs Bengals, somebody has to lose, so they were the one. So I think Cincinnati's still a good team, but nonetheless, what's the vibe? What's the chemistry like? That's so huge for any of these teams, but especially if it's like the strength of your offense, you've got to be on the same page. So it'll be interesting to see where the Bengals are in that regard. All right, number 4, Emmanuel Forbes. We know he had thumb surgery a couple weeks ago, sat out last week. He's been limited in practice the last couple of days, but Dan Quinn told us most likely he has a better chance of making his debut in week 4 than he does on Monday, but they're not closing the door. Forbes did have some reps the last couple of days, but it sounds like Quinn would like to have seen more before he puts him out there. So I'm going to guess that we will not see him this week, but next week sounds like much a better chance. Without Forbes, this is obviously, but look, I'm not saying with Forbes, it's a strong group, but without Forbes, they're even thinner than they already are. I'm imagining that Noah Igbenogany ends up starting on the outside opposite Benjamin St-Juste. Michael Davis really had some tough spots against the Giants, and with the Bengals receivers, I don't know if that's the way they want to go, but even with Igbenoghy, he's more of a slot guy. It felt like going in all summer. So this is what they're going to have to do to get by. I still wonder what if there's anything else they might do. I'll come back to that in a second. But so anyway, so that actually I'll get to that right now. So that's the notion there with regards to Forbes and that situation. And it does make me think. I've said before, I like what Washington. This is my next point. I like what Washington did generally this offseason because I understood they weren't really, again, trying to push hard for the playoffs this year. If it works out that way, especially if Daniels has a big year, so be it. But, they didn't want to lock up too many guys to long-term deals. So other than, Frankie Louvu, Tyler Biadasz, Dorrance Armstrong, everybody else pretty much got like a one-year kind of a deal. But for some of those one-year deals, we know they added guys who've been big names in their career. Bobby Wagner at linebacker, Zach Ertz at tight end, Jeremy Chin at safety. Austin Eckler technically has like a 2-year deal sort of, but Austin Eckler a running back, right? These are guys who, if they hit, could be huge value signings for this group. If nothing else, you give the locker room some guys who, professionalism and know how to play and all that, win and all that stuff. But one thing I do wonder is why didn't they, if they're going to play that game, why didn't they sign somebody the equivalent of a Wagner or an Ertz or whatever at cornerback? Because when you looked at the situation going into the year or going into free agency, Benjamin St-Juste, we'll just say he's fine, solid, what have you. I mean, there's ups, there's downs. We know how the last few years have gone, struggles to make interceptions, but there's talent there. Just got to, keep working at it. He did had that peanut punch fumble, forced fumble last week. That was a good thing. And he's got good size and all that. And then they ultimately draft Mike Sanders, still, as we know, in the second round to play in the slot. And Emmanuel Forbes is a wild card, no doubt. It was talent, but it was kind of a mess last year. So how would the staff deal with that? But still, you can't tell me that situation. They didn't know about Sanders still at that time, but they in their head they're going to draft a corner. You can't look at that and think, well, this is we're pretty good here. You needed somebody not necessarily to replace Kendall Fuller, but somebody. Well, again, the Ertz, the Eckler kind of equivalent of that. Now, I don't have a name for you. It doesn't even matter. But the guys out there, there's still even a couple guys, free agents right now, who you could make a claim would be probably better than what you're getting out of Mike Davis, most likely cost a little more money, but that's my point. You had the cap space. Again, I'm not talking about multi-year deals. I'm not even saying go out and, spend crazy money, but like the general money, $3 to, $8 million range, get somebody. It feels clear that they have some holes there for sure. And I think the fact that their weaknesses at corner is part of the reason why I don't think we've seen the full-throated version of this Joe Witt defense where they're having blitzers kind of coming from all different angles, because I don't think I'm imagining they don't think they have the cornerbacks to hold up. So this is food for thought. It's just a thought that floated through my head. But to me, it is a notable situation to say the least. All right, the Bengals defensive tackles is going to be my next point. This is if Washington has an potential advantage in this game, it's the run game, not just because Robinson and Eckler have been very good through 2 weeks, but because the Bengals are missing a bunch of defensive tackles, and they're going to, they signed Lawrence Guy this week, a longtime vet in the league, off the street. He may end up having to start or at least play a high amount of snaps because they're that thin at the position. And this is, again, someplace where Washington maybe could take advantage of it. Of course, for the Bengals, they weren't stopping too many people in the run anyway when they had some of their main guys. So maybe this isn't really as big of a deal in that regard, but it is something that this is where Washington should have a chance to take advantage of, milk the clock, move the sticks, keep pressure off of Jaden Daniels with a run game. So I think this is an area to watch. The defensive tackle means Tyler Biadasz, Sam Cosmi, Nick Allegretti getting after it inside as well. Trey Hendrickson is Cincinnati's best defensive end. He probably gets a few reps inside just to help the cause there. So we'll see what they look like there. But I think from Washington's perspective, the run game against that defensive front is a place where they should be able to make some hay, get some yards, move the chains, and all that. And also, the more you're running, the more, milks the clock, keeps Joe Burrow off the field. All of that is a good thing. Speaking of Joe Burrow, I have a story up, I think for Monday, about the Joe Burrow, Jaden Daniels dynamics. Obviously, both guys, LSU Heisman Trophy winning quarterbacks. Daniels follows Burrow at LSU a couple years later. And that was, he talked about the pressure he felt dealing with that. He's even said that there's more pressure he felt backing up Burrow coming off that insane season in 2019 than going into the NFL. But the story I wrote is also about how it's not so much directly about those two guys. It's about how their journey to this point is actually, they're similar to each other, but very different than a lot of other guys who are picked first and second in their draft. Because nobody saw entering their last year that these guys were going to be a Heisman Trophy winner, a top 3 pick, or top 2 pick, all that stuff. Whereas a lot of guys like your Caleb Williamses of the world, we kind of could see that coming a year or two out. And that's what makes them unique relative to a lot of the other high picked quarterbacks and similar to one another. So you can check that out on Monday. But speaking of Burrow, I think he's an MVP candidate. He was actually the guy that, for The Athletic, we had to make our preseason picks on a bunch of different categories, and I picked him as my MVP. Obviously, 0-2 is not off to a good start for the team or for that pick, but I love Joe Burrow, the quarterback. Other than Mahomes, he's probably the guy I would take next. I mean, Josh Allen's obviously great, but I just love Burrow's competitiveness, not to mention, obviously, his quarterback skills. I would be very happy if I had the second pick in a fantasy kind of, I don't mean fantasy football the way we play with our friends. I mean, like, we start with all the players out there. You can make your own roster, pick whoever. I would be very tempted to go with Joe Burrow as my quarterback. So that they're 0-2, it just feels like it's a tough spot. I mean, I'm not saying Washington doesn't have a chance, but it just feels like if the Bengals are as pumped up as they should be, being down 0-2, and with Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase, it feels like a tough spot. But this is maybe me putting Joe Burrow. He's worthy of MVP discussion in a general sense always, but like, if he's going to be that guy this year, he's going to have a win here, and an impressive one at that.
eBay Motors is here for the ride. With over 122 million parts, you can make sure your number one ride or die stays running smoothly. Brake kits, LED headlights, bumpers, whatever your baby needs, eBay Motors has it. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time. Plus, at these prices, you're burning rubber, not cash. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply.
We get it. Distractions happen. That's why we designed the fully electric, full-sized Volvo EX90 with the latest technology to keep you and those around you safe. Its 2-sensor driver understanding system is designed to prevent distractions and help you stay focused. Reserve your Volvo EX90 today. Learn more at volvocars.com/US.
Hey everyone, Bram Weinstein here, play-by-play voice of the Commanders and founder of Empire Media, and we are so excited that Ben Standig has come along and joined us with Empire with his awesome podcast, Last Man Standig. I wanted to tell you about our 2 other primary shows, and selfishly, mine, the Bram Weinstein Show, which can be heard on ESPN 630 in DC from 11 to 12, but then becomes a podcast that goes up immediately at 12 o'clock, 5 days a week. Some of the best Commanders and DC sports coverage you're going to get. So if you love Ben's show, check out mine as well. And also, don't forget to check out the John Keim Report from Empire Media as well, the ESPN Insider. We are bringing you the best Commanders coverage all season long. Be sure to subscribe to all 3 of our Empire shows, Last Man Standing, The Bram Weinstein Show, and the John Keim Report.
As far as Jaden Daniels goes, I did talk to Taylor McLaurin today at practice about this, because he's the rare human being, maybe the only one, I'm not sure, but like a rare human who has caught in-game passes from both Burrow and Daniels. Of course, Burrow was at Ohio State with McLaurin for 3 years before he transferred to LSU. Burrow wasn't playing much in his Ohio State days, but they had garbage time often, and McLaurin and Burrow hooked up there. He's not the first one to say this, but he just said, look, the competitive level these two guys are at is pretty elite. And I think that's something we're going to see. We've already seen it with Daniels in front of us the last couple weeks, and Burrow has that in spades. So I think as much as we talk about the arm strength, the accuracy, all that stuff, the will for these two guys is going to be a big factor. Just not this game, but every game for these teams going forward. All right, where am I here with this list? Okay, I think this is number 9. Don't quote me on that. John Allen and Deron Payne for Washington. There was we talked to Joe Witt Jr. this week, as we do every week, defensive coordinator, and he talked about what he needs to see out of this group. They've got to improve on third down. They're currently last in the league in opponents' third down percentage. He also talked about just like they haven't quite gotten to that level of aggressiveness that they're looking for from their players. But he talked about a few guys who've been giving them some of that. The names he mentioned. I thought I had this here. Hold on, McHugh. So he mentions Bobby Wagner, who, I think we all anticipated Bobby Wagner being one of those kinds of guys anyway, but he had a game last week that really stood out to Witt and to Dan Quinn, as far as just that aggressive style as a tackler, as a hitter, just as a competitor out there. Frankie Louvu made the cut. I'm still waiting for that sort of breakout Frankie Louvu game, but when you watch him play, you can see what it is from an energy standpoint, why these guys gravitated towards him in the offseason. I mentioned St. Juste. He did again have that forced fumble last week, and he was mentioned by Witt. And the last one, Quan Martin, who Witt said even in that Tampa game where they didn't play great defensively, he really liked what Martin did. The thing is here, all 4 of those guys are in the back 7. No defensive linemen mentioned. That includes obviously Allen and Payne. I don't think they've played poorly, but their impact has not been enough relative to their salary. That I think that's sort of the bottom line. If you're going to get paid, you got to produce more. I mean, Armstrong, the same to an extent, and he did sign a 3-year deal, but Allen and Payne are still the guys on this team that you focus on. So I didn't get the sense listening to Quinn and Witt this week that they were like down on those guys or anything, but there needs to be more production. And so it's not probably fair to always talk about like how many sacks, an extra moment, an extra second, an extra hand grab, whatever it might be. They might have some by now, especially from that first game, but they don't. And again, Washington's gotten beat up on the run. They're getting messed up on third down. All these things come into play, and when you don't have much help at cornerback, you've got to get pressure up front. That's not just the 2 tackles, but they are the driving force. So I think, I don't know if this is the week that it happens, but it's got to start happening. And I think that's sort of the vibe that I got in general, that, I think everybody kind of understands that. Lastly, number 10, prediction time. Look, I think that Washington has, again, you've heard my expectation for this year. For me, a winning season is not necessarily a winning record. It's Jaden Daniels shows legit development and growth. So far, so good. And that this team is competitive, especially over the second half of the year. I don't think they were particularly competitive in the first game against Tampa Bay. They obviously beat the Giants last week, but the Giants, other than maybe the second worst team in the league behind Carolina. And if Graham Gano doesn't get hurt, I don't know that Washington wins that game. Yes, they did a lot of good things on offense, scoring on every possession, only field goals, but still scoring. But, a lot of penalties. The defense was still a bit rough. I didn't look at that game going, but I think they've turned the corner. I thought a little bit about that with Jaden Daniels as the second half went on. Actually, I think I did miss one of my points before, so this is 9 and 10, we'll say. What I was intrigued with Jaden Daniels, the first half against the Giants, it seemed like he was still, kind of jumping out of the pocket a bit quick when pressure showed up and maybe missing some opportunities down the field. But that throw to Noah Brown was a perfect example of what a guy who can hang in the pocket can do. He stood there even with pressure coming and threw a perfect dime down the middle to Brown for a 34-yard game, putting the ball in Giants territory. I asked Jaden Daniels if that was a sign of progress to him. I think he kind of said no, but just because he's not afraid of pressure. I'm not suggesting that he is, but he was bouncing out more. If this is a turning point, when everybody says he makes a mistake, learns from it, and moves on pretty quickly, if we see that this week, I think that's another really good sign of Jaden Daniels' progress overall, and obviously would help against the Bengals team, especially with Trey Hendrickson getting pressure all over the place for that group. But that to me is progress. Haven't looked at them in terms of the actual game and thought to myself, wow, this team has turned the corner. Let's see what happens. I mean, anything is possible, and we don't always know what's going to happen until it's already started to happen more than we recognize. I mean, maybe the Bengals are terrible. Maybe the Commanders are better than we think. But for me right now, I just don't. I think it's too early to say that. What I know is that going into the season, I think the Bengals, to me, were a legitimate AFC title contender and all that. So with all that said, if Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase and T. Higgins get a rhythm, they're on the same page, I think this is a long day for Washington's secondary. And while Brian Robinson and Eckler should be able to get a bunch of yards inside and Daniels has a chance to have an effective game, I just think Washington has too many holes. So I think the line is like 7.5 Cincinnati. Give me Cincinnati 28, Washington 17. I mean, all right, let's 27-17. How about that? Again, I'm at this point in the season, I just think I got to look at what I know. I don't know what to make of the Bengals. How do you lose to New England, one of the worst teams in the league, and then we're a pass interference call away from beating Kansas City? I think they're still pretty good despite the 0-2 record. So that's what I'm doing for the Bengals. Again, as long as Jaden Daniels performs well, he has not thrown an interception this year. He also hasn't thrown a touchdown pass. But if he continues to improve and the group overall, even though I'm predicting a 10-point loss, it could be a 3-point game into the fourth quarter, and then Cincinnati gets a touchdown and he gets a 10. So as long as they're competitive, as long as they're limiting, they're not having all those red zone penalties last week, they're improving on third down, etc. That to me will be progress regardless of the result. But in terms of the result, I've got the Bengals 27-17. All right. I think that's going to be it for me. Hope everybody has a good and safe weekend. Have some fun. I'll be off. I'm on to Cincinnati for this game, and then it will be straight on to Phoenix to watch the team practice in Arizona for the week leading into the week 4 game against Kyler Murray and the Cardinals. Again, make sure you subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss anything else we got going forward. The Last Man Standing podcast. Subscribe to The Athletic if you haven't yet. If you have an interest, that would be fantastic. You can follow me on X at Ben Standig. And there you go. That's all I got. I'm gonna drink I got some coffee. I need some coffee. That's all. That's my next move. But for now, Ben Standig signing off. Until next time. See ya.